in the region. We are here to talk today about diplomacy. And diplomacy in the 21st century is no longer an elitist activity. It is no longer the sole preserve of individuals working in ministries of foreign affairs. It has become an all-of-government activity. Diplomacy is, in fact, being practiced not only by state actors, but also by non-state actors, private sector actors, celebrities, non-sovereign entities. And it is an activity that therefore has had to adapt to changing conditions, to a multiplex, post-hegemonic world, to the proliferation of regional organizations and trans-regional organizations, and to the what I call the plurilateralization of politics in the form of G clubs, the G summits, G2, the G7, the G8, the G20, the G22, the G77. So, as my colleague Amitav Acharya said on day 2, we are living in a plural world, a complex, interdependent world, a world in which networked regionalism and trans-regionalism are becoming increasingly important. And I would add to what he had to say that we are living in a fragmented world, a world in which fragmentation and integration forces are at odds with each other. And we also live in an intermestic world. Intermestic in the sense that the lines between the international and the domestic are so blurred that many issues that diplomats have to deal with keep falling between the cracks. And the range of issues that diplomats have to deal with has become very vast, ranging from global health, food security, women and children, climate change, disaster management, risk reduction, human rights, terrorism, cybersecurity, etc. Small states like ours in the Caribbean need to think very differently about how to conduct foreign policy. Most small states do not have the resources to individually sustain effective diplomatic practice at the regional level or at the international level. So I think my panelists here today can address some of these questions I have, some of which might in fact lead to some disruptive thinking. How can small states punch above their weight in a multilateral fora when they find themselves in asymmetric battles with larger, much more endowed states? What training and skills are needed to help small states achieve their foreign policy objectives? Are there certain types of issues that small states should strategically concentrate on? Is it possible for small states in our region to develop a common foreign policy? What would it take to accomplish this? Why can we not think about pooled sovereignty as opposed to maintaining our individual nation-state sovereignty? How can small states increase their diplomatic leverage by incorporating non-state actors, private individuals, in their foreign policy decision-making? These are some of the issues I think that we will cover in this session. It's the final session of the forum, and I hope you stay with us to the end. And we have a distinguished panel with us. Professor Andrew Cooper, who will speak on the future of small states diplomacy, matching disruptive thinking with constructive forms of activity. We'll go first.
Well, I have to say, I consider Andy Knight a great friend of mine, and I have a great admiration for Minister Dookeran, but they've given me a hard task. Late afternoon, I'm an outsider. I visited Trinidad and Tobago since 2003, but you never understand Trinidad like locals. And at the same time, they've given me a topic that sort of connects two dots that was probably an odd pairing: disruption, diplomacy. I would think most good diplomats, professional diplomats, would say that they want to avoid disruption. And indeed, there's lots to be said for that. There's a club system of diplomacy, a guild, where you pass on the knowledge of past masters. And of course, in the Caribbean, there are past masters, just like there's present masters. At the same time, if you look at small countries, you can see there's a great loyalty to many of the embedded practices. Sovereignty. We've heard a lot about sovereignty over the last 3 days. Loyal. Small states, they realize the problems of intervention from big states. They're also loyal, of course, to the many traditional institutions, including, of course, the United Nations. There's a great deal of reason for that sense of solidarity, not only with the institutions, with the General Assembly, but loyalty to the sense of solidarity through the G77, through a wide variety of other activities. But at the same time, I think, as you appreciate over the last 3 days, there's a sense that disruption is coming, whether we like it or not. I'm going in 10, 12 minutes to go through 4 sort of big challenges I see, both sort of unique challenges for small states, but also sort of generic challenges that if I was talking in Canada, I think I would say the same sort of practices. And at the same time, 4 possible solutions, or at least way forward. Again, one has to be modest, but at the last session, we have to, again, try to be disruptive. What do I see? The first challenge of disruption is the triumph of the bigs. And I think this is very much since 2008. We would have thought that in many ways the United States, with the crisis, the euro, world would have been in more than recession economically, but recession diplomatically. What we've seen is a recalibration, particularly through the G20, as Andy Knight has suggested. But also, even if the G20 is the hub, a whole range of technical-oriented institutions that small states don't have access to. Again, the FSB, IOSCO, all sorts of institutions that do technical work that in some ways have had entrepreneurship since 2008 in a very creative way. This is sort of problematic for small states. And of course, in some ways, the big banks have triumphed as well. Too big to fail has allowed banks around the world to consolidate since 2008. Again, triumph of the bigs in a wide variety of ways. The second sort of sense of disruption is the ascendancy of informality. Once more, we've had very good presentations from representatives of formal institutions. But since 2008, we've seen a whole plethora of informal institutions, self-selected institutions, not just the G20, but a whole set of institutions belonging or self-selected by countries that in the past have had the same commitment to the universal, to the formal institutions that small states have. Think of the BRICS, moving from this Goldman Sachs notion in 2001 to a meeting of foreign ministers, to a summit that everybody expects will not only talk, but begin to deliver action through the BRICS Development Bank. We've seen, of course, a whole set of other informal institutions coming out of this, basic in the environmental world. And the sort of catch-up from other countries. Our speaker from Mexico talked about the Pacific Alliance, but we can also see the Mexican initiative, along with the Koreans, along with the Turks, along with the Australians, Indonesians, of MICTA. Again, still at the foreign ministers level, but we never know. There's a summit not only regionally, and again, we've seen a proliferation of regional summits in this regard as well. And we've also seen, of course, informal organizations operating in a different way. Think of the Gates Foundation, not only sitting around the table in one of the G20s in the south of France in 2011, but of course also competing, as we'll hear, I'm sure, with the World Health Organization for primacy in health governance, health policy. So certainly there's a major challenge of informality. And if we throw in the TPP, not sort of just informal, but institutions that go around established practices, established institutions, we can see the sense of challenge for small states that, again, don't have access to those type of practices. In a more generic sense, we've seen a challenge for diplomats themselves, professional diplomats, from, again, as Andy has mentioned, from within the club, within the state system. Not just from line departments, from environment, from all sorts of other departments, but from leaders themselves. Leaders, in a sense, have discovered diplomacy. They want to be involved with almost every practice of diplomacy, not just in the older sense of war and peace, but in a variety of other ways. Go through the list, not just their presence at summits, trade promotion. Can you do a major trade promotion exercise without having a leader on board? You're not going to get the access to the same type of hierarchy in the country that you're targeting. Again, countries that don't have those practices are going to be at a disadvantage. Environment. Long ago, 1972, how many leaders turned up for the Stockholm Environmental Conference? 2. How many turned up in 2009 for the climate change conference? Between 110 and 115. We can see that this is, and of course, President Lula of Brazil brought his whole cabinet along as well. Sports even. We've had the mention of sports. Think of the champion of the Olympics, of FIFA, the sort of mano a mano sort of politics of diplomacy that Putin, Cameron, again, through the list of leaders that are supposed to deliver things that in the past it would be technocrats, ministers, and so on. This is a huge, diffuse sort of practices. But at the same time, we're seeing bottom-up citizen diplomacy, right? Everybody feels that they should, could, can, will be a diplomat. And in technical language, in academic language, this is what's called disintermediation. In some ways, chipping away at the trust, at the confidence, at the legitimacy for professional diplomats. Why should they have preferential treatment when people on the ground have a lot of not only knowledge, but of course, as we've seen in the last 3 days, a lot of passion about activities as well. So these are huge challenges. And of course, in very cliched terms, it means that professional diplomats